In this video, you're going to learn to recreate this interactive dashboard. This is a sales dashboard that I created using pivot tables and pivot charts, and then I've made it interactive using slicers and timelines. Now, the table of data that I used for this contains a number of attributes, and then it contains a data field. So the attributes are date, sales rep, sales manager, product category, product and sales. And we want to be able to analyze and slice and dice our sales by each of the attributes that's available in our table. Now, what we've selected is that we view our total sales, that we view our sales by sales rep and our sales by product. And then we have the ability to slice our data by our product category or by our sales rep. And then we also have a timeline that we can also add a filter on and slice the data by. So because I have this dashboard already set up, we're going to hop into another Excel workbook where I have copied the original table of data. And from here, we're going to start creating this dashboard from scratch. So to start with our original table of data, what I'm going to do is convert this into a table. To do this, I pressed Control and T for table, and I'm keeping this ticked that my table has headers. Now that I've created the table, I'm going to name it, and we're going to just quickly name it sales. So now we have our sales table set up. Now from here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start inserting some pivot tables. So I selected the Insert and Insert Pivot Table to give us our Create Pivot Table dialog box. Now this has correctly selected our table of data, our sales table of data, and we're going to want to put this pivot table on a new worksheet. So a new worksheet has set up with our blank pivot table. Now for those that of you are not familiar with pivot tables, we have a blank pivot table here. And we have our pivot table fields list over here. The pivot table fields list contains all of the fields that are in your original data source. So we have our attributes, our date, our sales rep, sales manager, product category, product and sales. And they were the attributes and the sales is the actual value. Now down here is where we drag and drop our fields to place them into our pivot table. So if we take our sales value and put it into our actual values, we see we have a value for sales over here. Now we can slice and dice this by all of our pivot table fields. So first I have selected date. So now we can see by year, it has grouped our sales by year, and it's added in these additional fields for quarters and for dates. Now I'm going to remove quarters because we don't need it. And I'm going to expand these fields here so that it shows our actual months. So now we have a pivot table that shows every year and every month that we have data for, and it shows our sales figures for them particular months of the year. Now I'm going to make a copy of this pivot table. So Control and C to copy, and then we can just paste our pivot table. Now I'm going to remove our date field. And instead of our date field, this time I'm going to put in our sales rep. So now we can see our sales grouped together by our sales rep. Again, I'm going to make a copy of this. So we copy and paste. And instead of sales, we are going to put in our products. So now we can see the sales of each of our products all grouped together. So we now have our three pivot table set up, and from here we can now start creating our pivot charts. So we'd select our first table of data, and I'm going to go to Pivot Table Analyze, and I'm going to say Pivot Charts. Now the chart that I want to insert is going to be a line chart, so I will select our line chart and say OK. So now we have our first chart, which is our line chart. So I'm going to cut this from here. I'm going to say Control and X to cut it from here. And I'm going to go onto a blank worksheet and I'm going to paste it into our blank worksheet. Now we have some formatting to do on this chart and some general formatting on the worksheet itself. So let's just make the first column a little bit bigger. And I'm going to come over here to column T, and for my home ribbon, I am going to select my format cells and I am going to select fill. And I'm going to fill this in this dark green color here and say OK. And now I'm going to select this second cell, and again I'm going to go to our font options and I'm going to fill the cell, but this time I'm going to go to fill effects. And I'm going to have a two color. So the first color is going to be this dark green, and the second color is going to come down to this much lighter green. And I'm also going to select that it is horizontal, going from the darker to the lighter, and say OK. This will then fill in the cell for us. And we can see now that we have the gradient going in there, but because I didn't select the same color as the first one, the gradient isn't exactly right. So let me go back in to our fill options and go into our fill effects. And this time I will select this green here. I hope that's the right green. And now we have this nice gradient fill on our top sheet. Now we can make this chart a little bit bigger because we have some guidelines now on where we can pull our charts to. So I'm going to select them like this. Now I can, from my design ribbon, from my format ribbon, select align and select snap to grid. And snap to grid will allow you to just take the chart and basically snap it to the individual grids. Now I'm going to pull this down because in our original dashboard, if you remember, we had our slicers and our timelines up at the top of the chart. So I'm just going to pull this down a cell. Now I'm going to go back into my pivot tables and I'm going to select my second pivot table. From my pivot table analyze ribbon, again I'm going to say select charts, and I'm going to stick with the column chart for this one. So I'm going to Control and X to cut it from here and into my dashboard sheet, and I'm going to paste it into my dashboard sheet. And again I'm going to go back to my pivot tables and I'm going to select my final pivot table. And again, pivot table analyze, pivot table charts, and this time I am going to select our bar chart and say OK. And I'm going to cut this from here and bring it over to our dashboard and add it into our dashboard. Now we can look at doing a little bit more formatting to our charts. So we can make these charts a little bit bigger. Make sure that they snap onto the cells, so we can select from our format, we can select align, snap to grid, and again with this one we can select format and align, snap to grid. So that means then when we try and move them around, they easily snap right into the edges of the actual cells. So I'm going to make this one a little bit bigger, and I'm also going to make this one here a little bit bigger too. Now we need to insert some slicers and we need to insert some timelines. Now slicers and timelines work off your pivot tables. So I'm going to select this first pivot table, and from pivot table analyze, I'm going to say insert slicer. Now I want to be able to slice by sales manager and by product category. So I'm going to select the two of these and I am going to cut these, select both of them, and I'm going to take them and put them onto our other worksheet. Just like this. And again, we will do some more formatting in a few minutes. And then I am also going to insert a timeline. So pivot table analysis, insert timeline. And then it asks us for a timeline to select the column that contains the date. So if Excel recognizes there's a number of date columns, you will have more than one column here to pick from. So I'm just going to select the one that is available. And I'm going to cut this from here and put it into our pivot table here. So now we can start on our formatting and making these look more like a dashboard. So I'm going to make our slicers smaller so that they fit in up here. I'm going to go to slicer element and align, and I'm going to snap this to the grid. I'm going to go to our timeline and I'm going to snap this to the grid as well. And that just makes it much easier to line everything up is when you snap it to the grid, because it allows you then to line things up directly with the corners of the cells. So if I make this one a little bit bigger, in our slicer option then we can change the columns to 2. And then in our product category one, we're going to change the columns to 3. And we can make this then a little bit bigger so we can actually read what is in the columns. And I'm going to scroll up and snap this in here, bring this one down, snap it in here and make sure it is the same size as the other slicer. And then we can make our timeline that little bit bigger as well. Now we also have some options for our timeline styles. And I'm going to select this green color here because it's more in tune with the coloring that I've selected for the chart. The same with the slicers. We can select the green toned slicers from the slicer style. And that will update our slicers to a more appropriate color frame for us. So now we have our slicers set up. But the only thing is we created these slicers from just one pivot table. And because of this, when we select items, we see only one pivot table updates when we pick the fields on the actual pivot table. The other tables are not updating at all. So we need to do something about this. So I'm going to select the slicer. I have a right click there and I'm going to say report connections. Now report connections will then bring up all of the pivot tables that you have available in your model. And we want this slicer to change each of the pivot tables. So I'm going to select all of the pivot tables for this slicer. I'm going to pick my timeline. And for my timeline, for my ribbon, I'm going to go to report connections. Now you can right click like I did a minute ago, or you can go in from the ribbons. So I clicked that time, report connections, and I'm going to select each of the pivot tables. So now when I select any of the items on any of the slicers, we can see that all of the charts are updating. Now it's time for us to settle down and format the actual charts themselves. So what I'm going to do is take these filters away. We see we have these filters here and filters here. So these allow you to drill down and give you information about the chart. If you right click on one of these, you have the option to hide all field buttons on charts. Now that gives these charts just that little bit extra space and it removes them buttons totally. I'm also going to come over here and I'm going to remove the label because we don't need it. And I'm going to remove the label on each of the charts. And I'm also going to remove the field buttons on each of the charts too. So I'm going to hide all field buttons. So you can see now that the charts are, there's just more space on them and they are a little bit easier to read. We can change our titles too. So our first title is our total sales. And I'm going to change our axis. So I'm going to change this to a bold. I'm also going to right click and say format axis. And this brings up our format axis bar. Now we have the option in the format axis bar to display units as a particular value. So we can see these values are quite large. So what we can do is make them look a little bit smaller by dividing them by any of these values here. So we can show them in 10,000s. So now we can see easily that that is 250,000 and so forth. So we're going to do the same with this throughout all of the charts. So I'm going to make that bold. And again, I am going to display the units on this one to 10,000. And down the bottom here, I'm going to make this bold. And I'm also going to change the display units to 10,000. And like I said, it just makes the chart that little bit easier to read. Now on my total sales in my header, I'm going to make this bold. I'm going to give this chart here a header. And this is our sales by sales rep. And I'm going to make this bold. Again, it's for consistency throughout the charts, because when you have consistency in a dashboard, it can be a lot easier for the eye to quickly scan and read the information that it needs. So this chart is sales by product. So now we can see our sales by sales rep, our sales by product, and we can see our total sales. So I'm going to make this bold as well, just for consistency. Now let's go back to our line chart and do a little bit of formatting from the line chart. Now when I selected the line in the chart, the data series updates, your format box updates. So it doesn't matter which one you select. If you have your format box open, you see now it's format axis because I've selected the axis. And when I've selected the series, we have format series. So I'm going to change the color of this, and I'm going to make it a dark green color. And I'm also going to make it a smooth line. And then I'm going to go into my shadowing, and I'm going to add a little bit of shadow to this just to give the chart a little bit more depth. So you can see there now the shadow has been added. I'm also going to select the grid lines in this chart. And now that the grid lines are selected, we see our format box has updated to be our grid lines. Now with our grid lines, I am going to increase the transparency of these, which should make them a little bit lighter on the chart. There we go. And I think I'm happy now with how our total sales chart looks. Let's come down to our sales by our sales rep. And I've selected all of the columns. And on all of the columns, I'm going to go to fill, and I'm going to select a gradient fill. Now our gradient fill has already selected some colors here for me. But we can go into our gradient fill and you can pick the different color tones that you want to use within your actual columns themselves. Now we see this is a 3 color. We can change this to a 2 color if we wanted to change it to a 2 color as well. And we can just say okay to that. And then I'm going to go to our series options, and in our gap width, I'm going to reduce our gap width to only 50%. And that makes the columns stand out a little bit more. They're an awful lot wider than they were originally. I'm going to do the same then with our sales by our products. I'm going to select the bars, and I'm going to select a gradient fill. Now you see here with this gradient fill, we have a dark color at each end and a light color in the center. So I'm going to select and change this so that we just have our dark color. So I'm going to delete this and say okay. So now if we go into our series options, and again we can reduce the gap width, and I'm going to reduce the gap width to 50% here as well. Again, it just allows you to see the bars that little bit clearer than when they were so shortly set up earlier on. So now we have our dashboard nearly finished. What we're going to do now is insert a text box, and in our text box I'm going to select all of these cells up here, so it's easy then to center and align the text. And I'm going to call this sales dashboard. I'm going to make this bold and maybe a little bit bigger, and I'm going to center it. Then I'm going to make sure that there is no fill on our text box. And I'm also going to select format shape. And from our format shape, I'm going to make sure that there is no border as well. So now we can't see the border. The final steps then is if we go to our view ribbon. And in our view ribbon, we can remove the grid lines from the worksheet as well. Now our dashboard is looking an awful lot more like the dashboard that we had originally. We can select our sales manager, and we can see the charts are updating based on the actual sales manager, each of the charts. So our total sales chart updates, our sales by sales rep, and our sales by product. If we take our product category, this also updates all of our charts. So I can remove the filter from sales manager, and I can just look at different product categories. But you can look at them in addition to particular sales reps as well, And if you wanted to, you can look at them in conjunction with particular months of the year, or we could change this to show quarters, so particular quarters of the year. So now what we're looking at is the sales for sales manager Linda. We can see all of her sales reps, we can see the products that they sold, and we can see the total sales for quarter 1 of 2020 for water sports. We can then look at outdoor, we can look at indoor, and we can explore the data as much as what is actually needed. So that's how you can create a very simple dashboard using slicers and timelines and pivot charts and pivot tables. I do hope that you enjoyed this video. Take it easy. Goodbye now.